Well, good morning, everybody. We're going to have a try and understand this parable, the parable of the shrewd manager. Just to check now, how many are familiar with it? Put your hands up. Yes, nearly everybody's familiar with it. It's a very difficult parable because it appears that Jesus is commending something that is very, very odd indeed. So, first of all, we'll read the parable as it is in Luke chapter 16. So if we can have the next one up, please. There was a rich man who was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer." The manager said to himself, "What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I will do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses." So he called each one of his master's debtors. He asked first, "How much do you owe my master?" 900 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. Then he asked the second, "And how much do you owe?" 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, "Take your bill and make it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. And verses 8 and 9 in the scriptures we usually use, Jesus said, "For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so that when it's gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings." Jesus was passionate about getting his message across. So he used stories or parables. And of course, what he did, he took those stories and parables from incidents and things that are familiar with the people. We use the same trick, don't we, when we're telling stories and people. I'll just try a test on you. Last week, those who were here, the preacher used a little trick to use as an example. He talked about a paddle boat, or a paddle board, rather. Now, the interesting thing, and I won't test you, we remember that, but do you remember the point of the story? Anyway, Jesus told parables using incidents of the day to make people think and to understand what he was trying to say. And there's about 40 of these stories in the Gospels, all very different, all with a point. But what we're going to try and do this morning, and I've asked Dom to help me, we're going to have a discussion about what it's all about. What do you understand Jesus was trying to say when he said, "Be like that manager"? Just to perhaps make it a bit more urgent and direct. Whereas the story was in Jesus' time was an agricultural story, a community that didn't really have a lot of business associations. What about if we try and turn the story into a modern form? And I've had a go, and so let's read it now. So if we could have the next one. And this is a story about a 21st shrewd manager. So we'll have the story. There was a wealthy entrepreneur who owned a successful wholesale import business. The company was run by a managing director who was given full executive authority over the operations of the company. It came to the attention of the owner that the managing director had not always been acting in the best interests of the company. The owner had discovered that the managing director had started a rival business of his own, using his experience and contacts to benefit his own company. The owner therefore informed the managing director that after an investigation, and of course a proper preliminary disciplinary hearing, he was likely to be dismissed. Now, the managing director knew that when the facts came out, he would be unable to claim unfair dismissal or get an equivalent job. So he would need to rely on making a success of his newly formed rival company. So in the time that he had left, he took the following steps. He approached the owner's landlord, with whom he was already negotiating a new lease for the owner's property, and agreed terms more favorable to the landlord than to the owner, on the understanding that the landlord would in turn offer beneficial terms to the managing director's rival company. He then approached the owner's shipping agents and made an agreement that in the future, a higher commission would be payable. This arrangement being made in anticipation that the shipping agents would give the managing director's rival company preferential terms. When the owner knew the full facts, he praised the crooked manager because he knew how to look after himself. And the commentary that I put up on here is the paraphrase given in the Message translation. Jesus said, "Streetwise people are smarter in this regard than law-abiding citizens. They are on constant alert, looking for angles, surviving by their wits. I want you to be smart in the same way, but for what is right, using every adversity to stimulate creative survival, to concentrate your attention on the bare essentials so you really live and not complacently get by on good behavior." So that's the Luke parable, and that's a modern illustration. And Dom and I are going to try and puzzle it out. Now, the first question I want to ask Dom, in the story, in the Luke story and the one I've invented, the manager is going to be sacked because the owner's discovered he's been dishonest. And then in both stories, the owner says, "I commend you for being shrewd." So the first question I want to ask you, Dom, is he going to be sacked?
Oh, definitely. And he definitely should be sacked, yeah, because although the manager commends him being shrewd, he's still being dishonest. And dishonesty, can't be seen to pay. It has to be a penalty for dishonesty. And as you remember, Jesus also taught a story saying that you can't serve God and money. So he's making it very clear, and also in the parable, that to be trusted and to be trustworthy is very important for people of the kingdom.
Yeah, and in fact, that's exactly what Jesus says after he told the parable. This is the very bit in the scriptures where Jesus said you can't serve God and mammon. And he said, if you're trustworthy over small things, then you'll be trustworthy over many things. So I agree with you. I agree with you. Although he's commended for being shrewd, it isn't a parable commending dishonesty. Okay, what is it about? But tell me, Dom, what's your take on this parable? If Jesus is not commending dishonesty, but says this chap in the story acted shrewdly, what's it all mean?
Well, obviously, it's saying that Christians should be shrewd, and in a way that they should be as keen to be shrewd as, say, a football supporter. It's about, that their team winning the cup, winning a match. Because there's that phrase, isn't there, saying that Christians should be so heavenly minded as to be of no earthly use. And there was that time, of course, when Jesus sent the 12 disciples out, and he said, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore, be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. So really, he's saying that Christians need to be as shrewd as an organism, even more shrewd, even more savvy, if you like. Think of the parable about the wise and foolish girls. Remember that story when they were criticized? But the ones who were criticized were the ones who weren't shrewd or forward thinking enough to plan and take an extra supply of oil in case they were kept waiting. They had to go and buy oil. And when they returned, the doors were closed and they were shut out. And also the talents. Of course, that parable, that's very superb, I think, because the ones who actually took a risk and sort of invested in the future, they were praised. And the person who did nothing, didn't lose anything, but sort of buried his talents and gave it back the same number of talents, he was criticized as a wicked and lazy servant, and he was thrown out into darkness.
Yep, I go along with that, Dom. But tell me, give me some examples then of how I should take this parable and be shrewd as part of my Christian, as part of church life. What does it mean?
Well, you're probably not talking to the best person, John, but I can think of other people who are not shrewd indeed. For one thing, we have incredibly shrewd treasure in this church. There's often been the case where he's come along and said, oh, so-and-so says that we owe them so much money, like a school or something, the rent. And we say, oh dear, and I might say, oh, don't worry about it. I'll deal with it with such and such and such. And in the end, the people who say that we owe them money give us money. You might say, no, they gave us very much. They're very blessed. Another person comes to church, and he's persuaded me to become a member of Whitley Lakes Golf. And we go along, the person comes out, and the person gives the price, and that's and goes, can you do anything? And all I do and I think certain people, yes, we give it up to the soldiers, and it's just he said, well, he's a teacher. So thanks to that, I get a considerable reduction in me. I'm not shrewd at all. We're very lucky for those people. Also, things like charity. When somebody wants us to give charity, we say, well, don't forget, if they want to print a will in this church, for example, we should try. We should tell them to get money back from the tax. But we should try. and told them that they can also get the money back. And in a sense, it's like, there's always that dilemma when somebody asks you for money in the street, and you give them money and waste it on alcohol or something, drugs. And in a way, they would say that there is the rice at this place, and people every night. Please go along there, and why don't you come in here and I'll buy a sandwich? You know, be a little bit more shrewd in that way.
Yep. Yeah, I'm sure that's what Jesus was talking about, is that, and he actually compares the shrewdness, the savviness of the manager in a complimentary way. However, I think there's a different dimension to this. You see, the shrewd manager, because he'd got absolute control over the company, or he was the manager in Luke's story, he could simply have taken some money. Or in my story, he could have put the money in a Swiss bank account. He could have actually got money out of it. But that, of course, would only last him for a certain time. He acted more shrewdly. He had a choice. He gauged what his priority was, which in this case was to make friends so that other people would look after him when his money ran out or when he was eventually rumbled and so on. Oh, by the way, I did think about changing it, the modern story. I should have said she, the manager, but I apologize for that. So I think this story is basically a question of priorities. As we just remember, this story ends with the very powerful phrase, "You can't serve God and mammon." And right at the end, in verse 15, Jesus said, "God knows your hearts. What people value highly you think of is detestable in God's sight." There's a wonderful phrase in one of the verses in Hebrews. It's here we have no continuing city, or in modern translations, it's not here that matters. And I think what Jesus is trying to tell us in this parable is that we must get our priorities right. There's a Paul says in Philippians, something sometimes we find very strange. He says, "Work out your salvation with fear and trembling." Now, sometimes we think, wait a minute, we don't believe in working out our salvation. It's God's gift, it's His grace. He didn't work for your salvation, He worked out your salvation. And then in the letter, he goes on to say, it's by the Holy Spirit coming into your life that you can understand the priorities and so on. And I wonder really how often we tremble when we're trying to work out our salvation. So I think it's all about priority. And the commendation that Jesus makes to the manager is, yes, you've got your priorities right. You're looking to the future, not just grabbing what is in the immediate presence. The most forceful example of this, I think, comes at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus explained how Christians should live. And he tells the story or the parable of the foolish and the wise builder. The wise builder hears it, lodges it in his brain, doesn't do anything about it. And when the winds come and the rains come and the adversity comes, Jesus says that house was not built on a rock. The foolish builder I've got the wrong way around. The foolish builder is the one who doesn't do anything about it at all and fails. It's a question of understanding what we have to do and exercising our priorities. That, I think, is the commendation for this story.
But what about the surely, if the workers in the vineyard, I mean, was the manager shrewd in that case when he paid the same amount to the person who worked all day and to the work for an hour? I mean, doesn't that parable really show us that it's God's grace?
Yeah, I've no doubt at all that the question of priorities doesn't have anything really contrary to the fact that it's by God's grace that we enter his kingdom. But we have to be shrewd and understand our priorities and act on them. And that's really what I think this parable is saying. So I hope you will ask me, John, as I asked you.
Well, I will.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll ask that, you know, if this story is all about being true and the choice of our company, well, what does that mean for you, me, and for this church? For everything?
It is a difficult thing. But when, as I'm very ancient, I can look back on my life, I can see some of my choices, important choices, were kingdom choices, and some were hopelessly wrong. But I think when we come to important decisions, or even small decisions, we have to work out what it is we do with trembling and understanding how the Spirit leads us. We have a responsibility to act sensibly and to use our priorities in a forward kingdom sense. I'm thinking of important decisions like who you're going to marry. I didn't get that wrong, by the way. But these things are priorities. We cannot do everything. When I come to think about the priorities that face the church, I think we have to be true. We cannot, as a church, do everything. We know because of the existence of other churches that we can't run the whole gambit of what everybody else does. We have to find what our priority is as a church. Is it being friendly? Is it having a live worship? Being later on young people? All these things need to be carefully thought out in the light of our resources. This is something that we have prayerfully to do as a church. It's not easy. And I think we need God's help as we assemble by the power of His Holy Spirit to discern what is really important for us, what is our priority. How can we be as true as the manager in the story? We're going to sing a hymn now.